Hey, warrior, pause for a moment and listen to the quiet truth most people avoid. Life does not slow down for confusion. It does not wait for motivation. It does not ask whether you are ready. Every morning the sun rises with or without your permission, and the world moves forward as if nothing is holding it back. That simple fact is not meant to scare you. It is meant to wake you up. Because every time you open your eyes, you are given proof that you are still in the race, and at the same time, a warning that standing still is a decision you will pay for later. Think about how quickly things change. People you once spoke to every day are now memories. Opportunities you assumed would always be there quietly disappeared. Versions of yourself you once recognized feel distant now. None of that happened overnight. It happened because time kept flowing while attention drifted. This is why mornings matter. Morning is not just a time on the clock. Morning is the point where direction is chosen. You either move with intention or you allow inertia to decide for you. Most people wake up already behind. They reach for their phone before their feet touch the floor, letting noise, comparison, and other people's urgency pour into their mind. By the time they stand up, they are already reacting instead of leading. They don't choose how the day begins. The day chooses them. And when that becomes a habit, life starts to feel like something that happens to you instead of something you shape. Stoic wisdom offers a different lens. It begins with a sober acceptance that time is finite and unforgiving, but deeply fair. Every day gives the same opportunity. What differs is how we meet it. The Stoic does not wake up asking what the world will give today. He wakes up asking what he will do with the time he has been given. That shift alone changes everything. Because once you understand that life waits for nobody, urgency becomes clarity, not anxiety. There is a dangerous illusion that whispers to many people each morning. It says there will be time later. Later to start taking care of yourself. Later to build what matters. Later to change habits that are slowly draining your energy. But later is not guaranteed. Later is a story the mind tells itself to avoid discomfort now. And every time you listen to it, you trade a piece of your future for temporary ease. This is not about panic. It is about respect for time. Respect looks like getting up when you said you would. Respect looks like choosing movement over delay. Respect looks like acting while the desire is quiet, not waiting until motivation makes noise. When you live this way, mornings stop feeling heavy. They start feeling purposeful. Even difficult days carry a sense of direction because you met them on your feet, not on your knees. Ask yourself something honestly. If today were the day your future self depended on most, how would you begin it? Would you scroll and drift, or would you sit up and decide? Decision is power. Not the grand, dramatic kind, but the quiet kind that compounds. A single, clear decision each morning, repeated over time, reshapes identity. You stop seeing yourself as someone who waits. You begin to see yourself as someone who moves. This is where Stoic discipline quietly enters. Discipline is not punishment. It is alignment between who you say you want to be and what you actually do when no one is watching. Each morning gives you a small, private test. Will you rise into the day, or will you negotiate with comfort? The outcome of that test may seem insignificant in the moment, but over months and years, it becomes the difference between a life directed and a life deferred. Life does not wait for perfect conditions. It moves through chaos, uncertainty, and fatigue. If you learn to move with it, even imperfectly, you gain momentum. Momentum creates confidence. Confidence creates calm. Calm allows you to see clearly. This is the Stoic chain. It all begins with accepting a simple truth at the start of the day. Time is passing whether I act or not. I choose to act. Let this morning be different. Not dramatic, not loud, just deliberate. Sit up, take one breath. Acknowledge the reality that the clock is moving and you are still here. That alone is a reason to step forward. You do not need to conquer the entire day right now. You only need to refuse to waste the opening moments. When you respect the morning, The rest of the day listens. Carry this with you as you move into what comes next. Life waits for nobody, but it responds to those who rise to meet it. And once you accept that, you are no longer behind. You are in motion, quietly, intentionally, on your own terms. When you truly accept that life does not wait for anyone, another truth reveals itself, and this one is harder to face. No one is responsible for your life except you. It sounds simple, almost obvious, yet very few people are willing to live by it. Most people spend their lives searching for something to blame: circumstances, family, the economy, bad timing. Those reasons may sound logical, even fair, but quietly they take away the greatest power you have: ownership of your choices. Stoicism does not teach you to hate your circumstances. It teaches you to see them clearly, without lying to yourself. Life never promised fairness. It only promised this: how you respond to what happens will shape the direction of your life. Every morning, the moment you wake up, you stand at an invisible crossroads. One path is complaint, delay, and waiting for something or someone to change. The other path is acceptance, not passive acceptance, but the kind that says, I may not control what I was given, but I control what I do next. Many people live in a victim mindset without ever realizing it. They are not crying or complaining loudly. They are simply surrendering quietly. They tell themselves, now is not the right time, or I'll start when things are easier. Days pass, then months, then years, and slowly, responsibility is replaced by habit. The Stoics saw this as a loss of inner freedom, because the moment you hand your emotional state and direction over to circumstances, you stop living by your values and start living by conditions. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself that people are not disturbed by events, but by their judgments about events. Two people can face the same hardship. One becomes stronger, the other becomes bitter. The difference is not luck, it is responsibility. The Stoic does not ask, why did this happen to me? He asks, what is required of me now? Morning is the clearest place to practice this discipline. No one forces you to wake up with intention. No one controls whether you choose order or chaos, presence or distraction. Those small morning choices are quiet declarations of who is in charge. When you rise with awareness, you are saying, I lead my life. When you drift into the day unconsciously, you are saying, life will lead me. Many people fear responsibility because they think it means pressure. But in Stoicism, responsibility is not a burden, it is freedom. When you accept that no one is coming to save you, you also realize that no one has the power to stop you. You no longer wait for permission. You no longer need approval to begin. You become your own foundation. This does not mean you reject others. It means you do not place your life in their hands. You can learn from people, love people, work with people, but the final direction remains yours. Each morning, when you ask yourself, how will I show up today? You are practicing the core of Stoic philosophy: conscious living, personal responsibility, and inner sovereignty. Notice how it feels when you stop blaming. At first, it may feel uncomfortable because there is nowhere to hide, but soon, clarity replaces fear. You feel lighter, more grounded. You are no longer pulled by emotion or circumstance. You act from principle, not impulse. And that is when morning stops being just the start of a day and becomes the anchor of your life. Carry this truth forward. Life does not wait for you, but it always responds to how you take responsibility for it. And once responsibility is placed where it belongs, the next question is no longer, who failed me? But how will I use my power today? Once you accept responsibility for your life, another challenge rises quietly to the surface: regret. Regret is one of the most misunderstood forces in the human mind. Many people believe regret is proof that they care, that it shows awareness or growth. But when regret is left unmanaged, it becomes a cage. It keeps people staring backward while life continues moving forward without them. Stoicism never taught people to deny the past. It taught them to put it in its proper place. The past is not a home, it is a classroom. You visit it to learn, not to live there. Yet most people wake up each morning carrying invisible weight from yesterday, last year, or 10 years ago. Missed chances, wrong decisions, words they wish they could take back, paths they never chose. And instead of using that knowledge to move forward, they punish themselves with it. Marcus Aurelius warned against this mental trap when he reminded himself that the mind has the power to let go the moment it chooses to. Regret feels heavy because you treat it as something that must be carried, but regret has no physical weight. It only exists as long as you keep feeding it with attention. The moment you extract the lesson, its purpose is complete. The Stoic question is never, "Why did I fail?" The Stoic question is, "What did this reveal about me, and how do I move forward wiser?" Failure, loss, and disappointment are not verdicts on your worth. They are information, and information is only useful when it leads to action. Many people confuse regret with responsibility. They think holding on to pain is a form of accountability. It is not. Accountability is change. Accountability is adjusting your behavior, your habits, your direction. If nothing changes, regret is just emotional noise. Morning is the most powerful moment to practice this discipline. When you wake up, you are not obligated to relive yesterday. The body may remember, but the mind can choose. You can acknowledge the past without kneeling before it. You can say, "That happened. It taught me something, and it no longer controls me." This is not denial. This is strength. The Stoics believed that suffering multiplies when we argue with reality. The past is real, but it is finished. What matters is whether you allow it to sharpen you or shrink you. One path creates clarity, the other creates paralysis. Regret becomes dangerous when it turns into identity. When you stop saying, "I made a mistake," and start saying, "I am the mistake." Stoicism cuts that illusion at the root. You are not your past actions. You are the one who chooses what comes next. And that choice resets every morning. There is a quiet confidence that comes from this mindset. You stop rushing to prove yourself. You stop trying to rewrite history through explanation or validation. You move forward calmly, knowing that wisdom was earned, not wasted. You understand that growth often looks messy when viewed backward, but purposeful when viewed forward. So instead of waking up asking, "Why didn't I start earlier?" ask, "What am I willing to start today?" Instead of replaying what went wrong, commit to one action that moves you in the right direction. Action is the only true antidote to regret. Thought alone will never free you. Carry this with you as the day begins. The past does not need your attention anymore. It has already given you its lesson. The only thing left is to apply it. And when you do, regret loses its power and becomes quiet respect for the person you are becoming. Once regret no longer controls you, a sharper truth becomes impossible to ignore. Every single morning, whether you admit it or not, you are building something. The only real question is whose life you are constructing with your time and energy. Most people never consciously choose, they drift. And drifting always leads to serving someone else's vision by default. Stoicism is brutally honest about this. Life does not reward intention, it rewards direction. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself that a person's worth is measured by the worth of the things they pursue, not by what they say they want, not by what they dream about at night, but by what they consistently move toward when the day begins. Many people tell themselves they are being realistic. They say now is not the right time. They say stability comes first. They say they will focus on their dream later. But later is the most expensive word you can use against yourself. Later quietly turns into years, and years quietly turn into a life lived for someone else's priorities. This does not mean everyone must quit their job or reject responsibility. Stoicism never glorified recklessness. What it demands is ownership. Even if you work for someone else, Even if you have obligations you cannot escape yet, you still control how much of your inner fire you reserve for yourself. You still control whether your mornings belong to your future or to routine survival. Every builder understands this principle instinctively. They use the quiet hours. They use the early moments before the world starts making demands. Not because mornings are magical, but because mornings are uncontested. No one is asking you for anything yet. That time is yours, unless you give it away. The tragedy is not that people fail. The tragedy is that most never try long enough for failure to even matter. They trade their creative years for comfort, then trade their later years wishing they had been braver when it counted. Stoicism calls this a misuse of life, not because ambition is mandatory, but because potential wasted is a form of quiet self-betrayal. When you wake up without intention, you become reactive. Emails decide your mood. Deadlines decide your energy. Other people's urgency replaces your own purpose. But when you wake up with even a small commitment to your own vision, something changes. You move differently. You speak differently. You tolerate less nonsense. You feel aligned instead of scattered. Building your dream does not require dramatic gestures. It requires consistency. One page written, one skill practiced, one decision made in favor of your future instead of your comfort. Stoicism teaches that greatness is not loud. It is built through repetition and restraint. And here is the uncomfortable truth most people avoid. If you do not decide what matters to you, the world will decide for you. It will hand you priorities that feel urgent but mean nothing in the long run. You will be busy, exhausted, and unfulfilled all at the same time. This is why mornings are sacred. They are not about productivity. They are about alignment. Before you give your strength to the world, you must give direction to yourself. Otherwise, you become a tool instead of an architect. Ask yourself honestly, if nothing changed, if you kept waking up the same way for the next 5 years, would you respect the person you become? If the answer is no, then today is not just another day. It is a warning. The Stoics believed that each day is a complete life in miniature. How you begin it reflects how you live it. And how you live it determines whether you are building toward freedom or slowly surrendering it. You do not need permission to begin. You do not need applause. You do not need certainty. You only need the courage to claim a small piece of each morning for yourself and protect it without apology. Because in the end, there are only two outcomes. Either you invest your mornings in your own becoming, or you spend them making someone else's dream real while yours quietly fades. There is a quiet strength that most people never learn to use. It does not announce itself. It does not seek approval. It does not explain its intentions. It works. It observes. It grows. And by the time others notice it, the foundation is already unshakable. This is the discipline of silence, one of the most underestimated weapons in the Stoic way of life. We live in a culture that rewards noise. People share plans before they take the first step. They announce goals before they have built the habits. They seek validation while the work is still fragile. But the Stoics understood something timeless. When you speak too early, you weaken your focus. When you invite too many opinions, you dilute your direction. And when you expose a dream before it is ready, you risk letting doubt destroy it before it has a chance to grow. Think of your goals like seeds. Seeds do not grow because they are shown to the world. They grow because they are protected in the dark, watered consistently, and left alone long enough to take root. Silence gives your goals that darkness. Privacy gives them safety. Focus gives them strength. Most people talk because they want reassurance. They want to feel seen. They want confirmation that they are on the right path. But this need for validation often replaces real progress. The mind mistakes attention for achievement. Praise becomes a substitute for discipline. And slowly, without realizing it, the hunger to be admired overtakes the hunger to improve. The Stoic chooses differently. He understands that approval is unstable and opinions are cheap. Today, people support you. Tomorrow, they doubt you. The same voices that cheer can later discourage. So instead of feeding on reactions, the Stoic feeds on consistency. Instead of explaining, he builds. Instead of defending his vision, he protects it. There is another reason silence matters. Not everyone wants you to succeed. Sometimes this comes from envy, sometimes from fear, sometimes from people projecting their own limits onto you. Often it is subtle. A careless comment, a warning disguised as concern, a doubt disguised as advice. None of it may be intentional, but all of it can weaken you if you let it in too early. Silence is not secrecy out of fear, it is discipline out of respect for your energy. When you stop talking, you stop leaking motivation. You stop negotiating with outside voices. You begin to hear yourself more clearly. And clarity is power. Working in silence also changes how you experience effort. When no one is watching, your actions become more honest. You are no longer performing, you are practicing. You are not trying to impress, you are trying to improve. This creates a different kind of confidence, a quiet confidence that does not depend on being noticed. A confidence rooted in knowing you are doing the work whether anyone sees it or not. The Stoics believed that character is built in private long before it is revealed in public. What you repeatedly do when no one is watching becomes who you are when everyone is watching. This is why silence strengthens identity. You begin to trust yourself. And once you trust yourself, you stop needing permission from others. Celebrating in private matters just as much. Public celebration can steal momentum. It can trick the mind into thinking the work is finished. But quiet satisfaction keeps hunger alive. It keeps you moving. It keeps your standards high. You acknowledge progress without becoming attached to praise. You enjoy results without becoming dependent on applause. This does not mean you isolate yourself or never share anything. It means you choose timing wisely. You share when the work is stable. You speak when the foundation is strong. You let results speak first. Words can always follow later. Silence also prepares you for resilience. When setbacks come, and they will, you are not surrounded by expectations. You are not performing an image. You are simply continuing your path. Quiet work creates flexibility. It allows you to adjust without explanation, to fail without humiliation, to learn without pressure. There is freedom in this. Freedom from comparison, freedom from judgment, freedom from the emotional roller coaster of public opinion. You stop measuring progress by attention and start measuring it by discipline. You stop asking who noticed and start asking who you are becoming. If you want a practical rule, use this. Speak less about what you are going to do. Do more of what you said you would do. Let your mornings be productive, not performative. Let your evenings be reflective, not reactive. Protect the space where your future is being built. And remember this, silence is not weakness, it is control. It is choosing depth over noise. It is choosing progress over approval. It is choosing long-term strength over short-term comfort. As you move forward, carry this mindset with you. Build quietly, stay focused, remain consistent, and trust that when the time is right, your results will speak more clearly than any explanation ever could. This discipline of silence prepares you for the final truth, the one that ties everything together. Because once you learn to work quietly, you are ready to understand what truly determines the outcome of your life. Life does not wait. It never has, and it never will. Every sunrise is a quiet reminder that time is moving forward without asking for your permission. While you sleep, the world keeps turning. While you hesitate, opportunities pass silently by. This is not meant to scare you, it is meant to wake you up. Because the most dangerous lie you can tell yourself is that you still have plenty of time. Time is not generous, time is honest. It gives you exactly what you use and takes back everything you waste. And that is why mornings matter more than people realize. They are not just the beginning of a day, they are the beginning of who you choose to be. Most people drift into their lives. They wake up tired, distracted, already behind. They let habit decide for them. They let emotion lead them. They wait for motivation, permission, or the perfect moment. And years later, they wonder how life passed so quickly. The Stoics understood something most people never do. Life is not shaped by dramatic moments. It is shaped by small, repeated decisions, especially the ones you make when no one is watching, especially the ones you make in the morning when the day is still quiet and your mind is still yours. You now know the truth. Life waits for nobody. If you do not move, it will move without you. If you do not take care of yourself, the world will replace you and continue on. Regret is not a home you should live in. It is a lesson you are meant to leave. If you do not build your dream, someone else will gladly use your time to build theirs. If you speak too much, you weaken your focus. If you listen to the wrong voices, you lose your direction. And if you rely on excuses instead of consistency, nothing changes. Not your life, not your future, not your sense of self. But here is the power you still hold. Every morning, you are given a choice. Not a big one, not a dramatic one, a simple one. Will I rise with intention, or will I surrender to habit? Will I move forward, even slightly, or will I stay where I am? Will I respect my time, my energy, and my potential, or will I trade them away for comfort? These choices do not feel important in the moment, but they compound, they stack, they become your character, and eventually they become your destiny. Stoicism is not about coldness. It is not about suppressing emotion or pretending life is easy. It is about clarity. It is about accepting reality as it is and choosing to meet it with discipline, courage, and self-respect. The Stoics did not wait for life to become gentle. They became strong. They did not ask the world to slow down. They learned how to walk steadily through chaos. And that strength was built quietly, daily, through consistent action. You do not need to change everything at once. You do not need to become someone else overnight. You only need to stop wasting mornings. You only need to choose one small act of discipline and repeat it. Wake up when you said you would. Move your body. Sit in silence. Write one honest thought. Take one step toward your dream. Protect your energy. Ignore the noise. Do it again tomorrow and the next day. This is how real transformation happens. Not through motivation, but through identity. You do not rise because you feel like it. You rise because it is who you are becoming. One day, sooner than you think, you will look back and realize your life changed, not because of a single breakthrough, but because you stopped betraying yourself in the mornings. You stopped negotiating with weakness. You stopped waiting. You became someone who acts, someone who honors time, someone who moves forward even when it is uncomfortable. And that is when life begins to respond differently to you. Not because it became easier, but because you became stronger. So when you wake up tomorrow, remember this: no one is coming to save you. And that is not a curse. It is freedom, because it means the power is already in your hands. Rise, move, act, protect your time, protect your mind, build quietly, stay consistent, and let your life become the proof. Hold this final affirmation with you and live it, not just today, but every morning that follows. I rise stronger every morning, and I do not waste the time life gives me.